I'm Mike Farrington. These doors I just built are awesome, and so am I.
No, you're not.
In this video, I'm going to build and hang a pair of Dumbledores. And as with any awesome project, the first step is to build a couple of jigs. This first jig is known as a door buck. And what's a door buck? Well, it's just a thing that holds a door up on edge, which is convenient when routing mortises for hinges and other similar operations. And after the fancy pants track saw dance, I'm left with two triangles that look the same, but they are a little different. One is a right triangle, and if my 7th grade geometry is correct, the other is an acute triangle. All of this will make sense in just a minute when I assemble this sucker. In the meantime, I chamfer the edges and mark center lines on the remaining pieces. Building a pair of door bucks, I think these things work better when you have two of them. Each one consists of 5 pieces, 2 triangles, a base piece, and 2 face pieces. Everything's held together with the mighty mechanical fastener, the screw, and the center lines that I drew 21 seconds ago ensure that I hit the center portion of the plywood for maximum strength. Second component to a door buck is a sliding wedge, or as I like to call it, a swedge. I made no mention of the angle cut on this triangle earlier because it kind of doesn't matter. 3, 4, 5 degrees, something like that is fine. I end up just matching the wedge to whatever the angle happens to be. I ended up making 2 of these guys to accommodate different thickness materials. My plan is to use these door bucks for other things besides doors. For example, edge banding the sides of large cabinet panels. With the door bucks built and set aside, it's time to move on to jig number 2. This second jig is a template to help route the mortises for the hinges. And I start by ripping a piece of wood to the same width as the hinge when it's opened up. I follow that up by cutting the piece into lengths. These lengths represent the distance between each of the hinges. I also add a little notch to make way for the hinge barrel. And the last piece to make are just some side pieces, and these are just used to connect everything together. And before glue up, here's a quick look at how all this comes together. And I glue everything together with the hinges in place to make sure that the spacing is what it needs to be. And to pass over the joiner through the planer to grandmother's house we go, just to make sure that everything is flat and parallel. Next, I calculate and mark how much of the hinge leaf I want to lay onto the edge of the door and the jamb. Nextly, using my marked lines, I set up and cut a shallow dado the entire length of the jig. And I reference both edges of the jig to the table saw fence to make sure that this dado is precisely centered. After cutting the jig to length, I mill up a board that fits snugly into the shallow dado. I put it all together with screws and screws alone, no glue, just in case that runner ever needs to be replaced. So here it is all put together, and I'll show how it works later in the video, and I'll also talk a little bit more about some of the advantages of using a jig like this later as well. With the jigs built, it's finally time to move on to the doors, and I have some poplar and brown maple Decided to go with brown maple for the doors. It's a little harder than poplar, but it still paints well, yet it's cheaper than either soft maple or hard maple. I do my level best to ensure each part is as flat and square as is humanly possible. I started with 4/4 rough lumber and planed down to a final thickness of 7/8 or 13/16 of an inch. It's not real important at this point. I'm shooting for a finished door thickness of about 1.5 inches, plus or minus a little is okay. So to achieve that thickness, I laminate 2 pieces of material together. It's normally considered bad form to glue 2 pieces of wood together like this. Conventional wisdom suggests that there should be an odd number of layers when making a wood sandwich. I would normally agree with that. However, I've built a few handfuls of doors using this method, and I haven't had one go memories up yet, so I'm comfortable bending the rules in this situation. One thing to note is that I let these laminations lay around and rest for a couple of weeks before proceeding. I do this to help give time for the moisture introduced by the glue to find its way out. I think this helps stabilize each piece so it won't warp, bow, cup, twist, or whatever else. I come back the next day, take them out of the clamps, knock them apart with a mighty mallet, and set these aside to rest. I made a sophisticated plan, and if you're wondering, these are inches, not feet. After the pieces had thoroughly dried and rested, I gave them one final milling just to make sure everything was dead flat. I cut the rails to length using a table saw sled because it's more accurate than a chop saw, and this cut is what defines if the joinery will come together or not. I cut the stiles to length at the chop saw because cutting an 80-inch piece with a table saw sled is awkward, and this cut plays no role in the joinery. Now it's time to move on to the joinery, and I get started by marking all the pieces so I know which side faces which direction and goes where. I thought it would be fun to use 2 different methods for joinery, one for each door. The first one is simply a slot cut with a router table. I do it in 2 passes. I have the fence padded out with some shims. Make a cut, remove the shims, and make another pass at full depth. This slot will house the center panel of the door as well as a floating spline at each corner. Gluing up this first door is super simple. If it seems like the splines at each corner are a little small, I would agree. However, what makes this style of door work is that the MDF panel is glued in place. This adds a ton of glue surface and strengthens the door tremendously. It ensures that it will hold up for years to come. Keep in mind this is an interior door. I would never recommend doing this type of joinery for an exterior door. Door number 2 is going to be held together with the mighty biscuit. What? I wanted to do this to poke at all the biscuit naysayers on YouTube who say that the biscuit joint adds no strength, bro, and it's for alignment only. I've said it plenty on this channel, biscuits when used properly are properly strong. Couple of things though, in all fairness. I'm using a larger size S6 biscuit, and I'll be gluing the MDF panel in place to add strength to the door as I did with the previous door. Oh yeah, one more thing. I'm stuffing as many biscuits as I can in each corner. This is a good example of why I really like this tool. Even with all these slots and having to move the camera around, I only spent a few minutes cutting joinery. Point is, the biscuit joiner is the fastest handheld joinery tool in my opinion. And by opinion, I mean in actual fact. And of course, after glue up, you got to cut off the little giblets. At this point, these stiles have been glued up for over a month, certainly. This is the worst out of the four. It's off by like a 32nd, maybe even a 16th over 6 feet. I bring this up because if you find yourself with this issue, make this the hinged side. The force of the 3 hinges will help this piece into alignment. The only other option really is to flatten it out with a hand plane. Now that the doors are built, it's time to introduce them to the jigs we made earlier. I load a door into the door bucks and I clamp the hinge jig to the door. Then I clamp a door jamb to the jig. The jig is set up to reference the very top edge of the door. This means I need to clamp the jamb with a 1/8 inch poking out the top to establish the reveal. So the way it's set up is the jig to the door and the jamb to the jig. This means everything gets routed quickly and, more importantly, perfectly the first time with minimal setup. The next move is to pre-drill for the hinge screws. I do this with the hinges in place. I leave everything clamped up the way that it was, and I use a VIX bit. I number each hinge as I take them out. I'm not using a particularly high quality hinge, so a fair amount of variance can occur from hinge to hinge. All right, time for pro tip. Add a dab of wax bigger than a sesame seed, but smaller than a pea to each screw. This will allow it to spin in easier and cut the threads with less risk of snapping off a screw head. And I just use a butt joint and screws for the top jamb. This is great because it makes adjusting the width of the door opening easy versus if there was a rabbet involved. And let me tell you, anytime a rabbet is involved, things get more complicated. And when it's all put together, the door to jamb has a really nice even reveal. Now, where the doors meet in the middle, there is no gap at all. I like to mark this by hand, and then I come back with my powered hand plane, and I take a few passes, and I do this because as I'm taking those passes, I add a slight bevel. This bevel is what allows the doors to close together without bumping each other. Now it's time to deal with a few more pieces of hardware. I start the door knob installation by marking for the faceplate and drilling a hole for the knob from both sides. I follow that up with a hole for the latch assembly, and I find rocking the drill back and forth, creating an oval, helps with latch installation. Time for another jig. Second to last one, I promise. All I'm doing here is gluing 4 pieces of wood around the latch assembly's faceplate. These wings hanging off each side aren't there for their good looks alone. These help with alignment, either feeling with your fingers for center or measuring. Also, they're the best place to clamp the jig to the door. After setting the router bit depth and clamping the jig in place, routing takes only a few seconds. Behold, the final jig of this project. This little thingy here is called a strike plate. It needs to be routed into the other door, the door without the knob. Next item on the agenda is the flush bolt. I use a router with an edge guide attached and adjusted, as well as an extra block of wood clamped to the door for some extra stability. Time for another pro tip. Oftentimes hardware like this is sold as 3/4 of an inch, when in reality it's something else. Could be a metric conversion, could just be their size wrong from the factory. So always measure. In this case I used a 23/32 inch router bit and it cut a slot just right. Final tiny piece of hardware is the plate for the flush bolt pin to lock into. This has square corners, so I use a router to remove the bulk of the waste and finish up with a chisel. And of course, I measured and marked wrong, so I ended up doing this process twice. I spend a good chunk of time sanding everything. I pay close attention to the corners and I make sure that they aren't too sharp. After sanding, I throw down a few coats of a shellac-based primer and then it's off for installation. Once the primer is dried, it's time for installation. I'm just going to share a quick overview of how I install doors. Door installation would be a video unto itself. I start by putting the jamb in place and checking for plumb, level, flat, square, etc., etc. When it's close enough, I hold everything in place with shims and screws, not nails. Screws make adjustments easy like Sunday morning versus nails. When I've put enough screws in the jamb to be secure, I pop the doors on and start checking for reveals and adjust as necessary. In this case, the floor was out of level by about 1/2 inch. I like to use a block of wood the size of the gap I want at the bottom of the door to mark my cut lines. From there, it's quick pass with a trusted track saw and the bottom reveal is set. I nail the stop moldings in place and I break out my favorite new marking tool, a 4-inch double square. It's great for on-site carpentry work because it's small enough to comfortably fit in my tool belt, but big enough to earn a place in my heart. I use this little shaver to mark for the astragal molding, which then gets glued and nailed in place. And the terminal tedious task is to install the Mike Farrington lever. Oh, I'm sorry, I mean the dummy lever. Pardon me, that's an easy mistake to make. That wraps it up for this build. I'll add some casing and paint everything at some point. I'm remodeling the room behind these doors into a proper office, and I want to do all that stuff at one time. I'll have another video or two out revolving around the remodel, so stay tuned for that. Thanks for watching. Till next time.